For roughly 57 years, a lump of Victorian cast iron sat on stages across Britain with 200 pounds sterling riding on it, and not one man in the country could pull it off the floor with a single hand. It weighed 172 pounds, which is not a lot, and that is precisely what made the whole business so maddening. The object itself is almost boring to look at. 2 round globes, a short bar between them, no engraving, no polish, no theatrical flourish. It weighs 172 pounds and 9 ounces, which any professional strongman of the Edwardian period could have handled without breathing hard if it had been shaped like a normal dumbbell. But it was not shaped like a normal dumbbell. The handle measures 2 3/8 of an inch across, roughly the thickness of a soda can, and the whole thing was cast as one solid piece so the handle cannot spin inside the globes. That last detail is the one most people skip over, and it is the detail that does the killing. On a modern dumbbell, if the weight starts to rotate in the hand, the handle turns with it, and the grip stays put. On the Inch Bell, nothing turns. The globes sit close in on either side, so a normal hand cannot even wrap the full circumference, and as the weight comes off the floor, it wants to roll out of the fingers like a wet bar of soap that happens to weigh as much as a person. Most men who try it do not fail at the top. They fail before the iron ever leaves the ground. The man who ordered it made was Thomas Inch, born in Scarborough on the 27th of December, 1881, on the Yorkshire coast, where the North Sea comes in cold and gray most of the year. He was not born strong in the mythological sense. By his own account, he built himself through manual labor and stubbornness, which was the standard origin story of the period, but happens to be true often enough that it is worth taking seriously. He won his first competition at 15 in Bradford in 1897 at strand pulling, which is essentially stretching a set of steel spring cables across the chest. Not glamorous, but it started him. Like nearly every British boy with an interest in muscle at the turn of the century, Inch was orbiting Eugen Sandow, who was then the most famous physical specimen alive. There is a story, and Inch told it himself, that he watched Sandow tear a pack of playing cards in half on stage and throw the 2 halves into the crowd. Inch caught one of them, tore that half in half again in his seat, and threw it back. Whether that happened exactly as described is anyone's guess, because strong men of that era told stories about themselves the way fishermen describe fish. But it tells you everything about his temperament. He was competitive to the point of rudeness. He moved to London in 1902 to go professional, and that same year, a major strength publication declared him the world's strongest youth, which was less an official title than a very effective piece of press. What separated him from his rivals was a matter of taste. Most professional strongmen of the Bronze Era leaned hard on spectacle. They hoisted barrels, they held back horses, they lifted pianos with people sitting on them, they did anything that photographed well in a newspaper. Inch mostly refused all of it. He wanted to be judged on barbells and dumbbells, on lifts that could be weighed and compared. His one concession to showmanship was that he occasionally bent pressed a live human being over his head, which he seems to have regarded as perfectly reasonable behavior. On the 10th of June, 1910, he won the contest that made him Britain's strongest man, a title he would carry for the rest of his career and mention in print roughly every chance he got. Because that is the other half of Thomas Inch, and you cannot understand the dumbbell without it. He was a businessman. In 1903, he launched a mail-order muscle course that grew into the most popular in the country, and in 1905 he published Scientific Weightlifting, the first of a long run of books and articles that kept his name in circulation for 6 decades. He was also a genuine equipment innovator. Inch pushed the adoption of plate-loading dumbbells and barbells at a time when most lifters were still working with fixed globes that had to be filled with lead shot or sand when you wanted to go heavier. He was serious about the sport as a sport too. He was a driving force behind the British Amateur Weightlifters Association. As it took proper shape around 1910, sat on its committee, and refereed at its first official competition in March of 1911 at the German Gymnasium in London. So this is not a carnival huckster. This is a man building the infrastructure of British weightlifting with one hand while selling courses with the other. Now, the dumbbell. He He had it cast around 1906, and the challenge attached to it was simple and public. Lift it clean off the floor with one hand and the money is yours. The figure most commonly quoted is 200 pounds sterling, which in 1906 was not pocket change offered for a laugh. That was more than most working men earned in a year, potentially several years, depending on the trade. Inch was betting a small fortune that human hands do not work the way people assume they do. And he took that bet on the road. The bell traveled with him through music halls and exhibitions across Britain, sitting on stage looking utterly unremarkable, waiting for the strongest man in the audience to come up and embarrass himself, which they did, apparently in enormous numbers. Later accounts throw around the figure of thousands of failed attempts across the decades, and while nobody was keeping a ledger, the general shape of the claim holds up. Later retellings like to attach famous names to the failure list. Arthur Saxon, the great bent presser; Maxick, the muscle control genius; Maurice Dariaz; Ivan Podubny; Lionel Strongfort. It is a fantastic list, and it makes for a great line in a video, but the documentation behind most of those specific failures is thin to non-existent, and much of it traces back to Inch himself, or to writers repeating Inch. What can be said with confidence is that Inch was offering the challenge to strongmen in an era absolutely swimming with strongmen, and the money went uncollected. So the obvious question arrives on schedule. If this thing was genuinely unliftable, why did Inch keep dragging it around for half a century instead of just being famous for his actual lifting? And here is where the story turns. Because the 172 was not the only Inch dumbbell. There were others, smaller ones. The weights usually cited are 75 pounds, 140 pounds, and 153 pounds. And the crucial thing about them is that they all shared that same monstrous handle. Same thickness, same non-rotating casting, same cruel geometry. Only the globes changed, which means Inch had built himself a graduated training ladder for thick handle lifting that literally nobody else on earth possessed, at a time when nobody else was even thinking about grip in those terms. Read charitably. That is brilliant. It is progressive overload applied to a single specific weakness, decades before anyone used that language. Read less charitably, it is a shell game. Because if you have 4 dumbbells that look broadly similar sitting backstage, and one of them weighs 140 and one of them weighs 172, the temptation to bring out the lighter one when the crowd is watching is not exactly hard to imagine. There is a story that has circulated in strength circles for generations of a challenger straining and failing at the bell and finally shouting out in frustration, "Which one is it, Mr. Inch?" It is a wonderful line. It is also almost certainly folklore, passed down through the grip community rather than recorded in any contemporary paper, and it should be treated as legend rather than evidence. But folklore does not come from nowhere. That story exists because people were already suspicious while the man was still alive. Then there is the hole. Multiple accounts, repeated over many years, describe a hole drilled into the handle of the original bell. The suggestion that grew up around it is that Inch could seat a nail or a pin in that hole, giving his hand something to catch against and stopping the handle from rolling out of his grip. Other explanations exist. One of the more mundane is that it was simply a gas release point from the casting process, which is a genuinely common feature in old ironwork. But think about what a pin would actually do. The single hardest part of that lift is resisting rotation, while your fingers are already at the absolute limit of what they can hold. Give the hand one fixed point of purchase, and you have not made the lift easy, but you have removed the specific failure mode that defeats everyone else. Whether Inch ever used it that way, nobody can prove. The hole is real. The nail is a story. And then there is the biggest claim of all, which is what he said he could do with it. Inch stated, repeatedly and in print, that he had lifted the 172 from the floor with one hand and taken it overhead hundreds of times, sometimes twice in a single performance. Strength historians have been picking at that one for a century, and the consensus lands somewhere uncomfortable. Most accept that Inch could deadlift the bell one-handed. Very few accept the overhead portion. Those two claims need to be kept separate because collapsing them together is how the legend got inflated in the first place. Here's the thing though, Inch did not need to cheat to be impressive. His documented numbers are ferocious. A bent press of around 271.5 pounds in 1912, which beat Sandow's mark and was not a trivial thing to do in front of officials. A two hands anyhow lift in the region of 276 pounds. And the grip work stayed with him for life in a way that borders on absurd. He set recorded grip strength marks in 1947 and again in 1949 when he was in his 60s. At 68 years old, he was still deadlifting 540 pounds. 68. That is a man born in 1881, pulling 540 pounds in the years after the Second World War, still in the gym, still setting marks. Whatever else Thomas Inch was doing with his props and his advertising copy, the engine underneath was the real thing, which is what makes him so genuinely interesting rather than just a footnote. He was strong enough that he did not have to run an angle, and he almost certainly ran one anyway, because he was a professional in an industry built on selling the impossible. Inch died on the 12th of December, 1963, in Cobham, Surrey, 15 days short of his 82nd birthday. The challenge had stood for something close to 57 years. As far as any reliable record shows, nobody ever collected the money. Now the story leaves Inch's era completely, and it is worth being clear about that, because what follows belongs to a different world entirely. Everything up to this point is Bronze Era physical culture, the age of music halls and mail-order courses, and men in leopard print posing for postcards. Everything after this happens decades later, among bodybuilders and modern strength athletes who never met the man and were only chasing his ghost. The bell survived him, and it started traveling. At some point after Inch's death, it came into the possession of Reg Park, the Leeds-born bodybuilder who won Mr. Universe 3 times and became Arnold Schwarzenegger's boyhood idol. That alone is a nice piece of continuity, one Yorkshireman's iron ending up with another, spanning the gap between the old physical culture world and golden era bodybuilding. Park sold it on to a collector named Bert Lightfoot, and Lightfoot sold it to a British weightlifter and bodybuilder called David Prowse. That name might not land immediately, so allow a moment. David Prowse, the towering British lifter, went on to become an actor, and the role he is remembered for worldwide is Darth Vader. He was the man inside the suit in the original Star Wars trilogy, which means that for a stretch of years, the most famous unliftable object in the history of strength training was sitting in the personal collection of Darth Vader. That is not a joke stretched for effect. That is simply what happened. A Victorian challenge dumbbell built by an Edwardian showman in Scarborough spent part of its retirement in the home of a man who would later stand on a Death Star set breathing through a mask. Strength history is full of strange connections, but that one is genuinely difficult to top. Prowse eventually sold it to an American collector named Kim Wood, and the bell crossed the Atlantic. Wood is a significant figure in his own right. He was the first full-time strength and conditioning coach in the National Football League, hired by the Cincinnati Bengals in 1975, Paul Brown's final season as head coach, and he stayed with the organization until 2002. He was also an early and vocal opponent of steroids in an era when that was not a popular position, and he was obsessive about hands, forearms, and grip, which explains exactly why the Inch bell ended up with him. And so, the most feared dumbbell in Britain spent years sitting in a living room in Cincinnati, Ohio, which is where the challenge finally got answered. The man usually credited as the first in modern times to lift the original off-the-floor one-handed is Richard Soren, an American grip specialist and the founder of Sorenex exercise equipment. The date most often attached to it is 1985, though that figure circulates mostly through the strength community rather than any firm published record, so treat it as the commonly accepted date rather than gospel. Soren was an extraordinary case regardless. He was pinch gripping a pair of 35-pound plates at 13 years old. In 1991, he became the first man to officially close the Iron Mind Captains of Crush No. 3 gripper, the recognized gold standard in crush grip, and then recertified on it in 2007 at the age of 57. He invented the blob, which is the cutoff end of an old York dumbbell, and in doing so more or less created modern grip training as a discipline. He died in 2024. The grip world has not really stopped talking about him since. Others got their hands on it too, with varying degrees of success and varying degrees of asterisk. Bill Kazmaier lifted the surviving 172 Continental style, which permits the weight to touch and rest against the body on the way up. That is a real feat. It is also a lesser claim than a clean lift, and the distinction matters to anyone keeping score properly. Then in June of 2002, at the Old Time Barbell and Strongman Association banquet, Mark Henry cleaned an Inch dumbbell to his shoulder with one hand and pressed it overhead. Henry was a 3-time United States national weightlifting champion and an Olympian before he was ever a professional wrestler, and by most accounts, he failed on his first attempt that night and got it on his second. There is a persistent disagreement in the sources about whether the bell he lifted was Inch's original or a replica cast to identical dimensions, and the honest answer is that it depends entirely on which account you read. Either way, the thing that had been described as unliftable for the better part of a century went overhead in front of a room full of witnesses, and part of why is simply anatomy. Henry has enormous hands. The single biggest predictor of success on the Inch bell is whether a person can get enough of their hand around 2 3/8 of an inch of iron to close a grip at all. It is not really a test of how strong someone is. It is a test of whether their hands are large enough to be allowed to enter the competition. So what is the verdict on Thomas Inch? Probably the uncomfortable one where both things are true at once. He was working an angle. The family of smaller bells, the hole in the handle, the overhead claims that historians will not sign off on, the fact that the challenge was always also an advertisement for a mail order course. All of that points in one direction. But the dumbbell itself is not a trick. It sat unbeaten for decades after the man who supposedly rigged it was in the ground. And world-class athletes with modern training still fail it regularly. That is the part worth sitting with. The hustle worked because the product was real. And 120 years on, that squat lump of Yorkshire iron is still winning almost every argument it gets into.